Hello, my name is John Barclay, and I'm the Lightfoot Professor of Divinity in Durham University. And I've been asked to say a few words about the great commentary by James Dunn on Romans, which has now been translated by the publisher Editora Academia Christa. And I'm delighted to say a few words about that commentary, which was written by my predecessor, James Dunn, who has sadly passed away recently. This commentary, first published in English in 1988, is a real landmark, a game changer in the history of scholarship on Paul, and is a fine example, one of the best examples of what is called the new perspective on Paul. In fact, that phrase, new perspective on Paul, was coined by James Dunn himself. Let me say a few words then first about what is the new perspective on Paul and why it's important. The new perspective on Paul stood over against the mainstream Protestant reading of Paul, which tended to focus on the salvation of the individual and tended to set up a contrast in its reading of Paul, a contrast between faith and grace on the one hand and what was called works righteousness or self-righteousness, salvation by doing good works, on the other hand. That language and that contrast between faith and works derives from the Protestant reformers, Luther and Calvin, and it provided a framework for reading Paul, which, as I say, tended to focus primarily on the salvation of the individual, who was encouraged not to look to their good works as the grounds, as the basis of their salvation, but to trust in God and in the grace of God. One of the effects of that traditional reading of that traditional Protestant reading of Paul is it tended to create a caricature of Judaism as a religion, not of grace, but of works, as a religion of legalism. Now, the new perspective on Paul, which this commentary and which James Dunn pioneered, grew out of the better reading of Judaism that began in the 1970s with the work of the American scholar E.P. Sanders, who argued, I think rightly, that Judaism is not a religion of works. The Judaism of Paul's day was not centered on works righteousness, but had its own theology of grace founded on the covenant. But another important part of the new perspective on Paul was that it shifted attention from the heart of the individual to the social dimensions of the gospel, and particularly the question of who constitutes, who belongs to the people of God. It put at the center of attention Paul's mission to Gentiles, to non-Jews. And Dunn's special emphasis was that when Paul talks about works of the law, he doesn't mean works in general or salvation by good works. He means Jewish works, works, if you like, of the Jewish law. And in particular, Dunn argued that Paul means those distinctive markers of Jewish identity by which Jews are distinguished from non-Jews in Paul's world. What were those distinctive markers? Well, Dunn argued, with I think good evidence, that the key things that distinguish Jews from non-Jews were circumcision of males, Jewish food laws, Jewish observance of the Sabbath, and Jewish refusal to take part in idolatry. And these were the things normally required of anybody who became a proselyte, anybody who converted to Judaism in the ancient world. And Dunn, with others, but Dunn especially, argued that Paul's main point in Romans is tied to his mission to the Gentiles and is an insistence that Gentiles do not need to become Jews in order to belong to the people of God. That the gospel, if you like, is not for Jews only. You don't have to take on the works of the Jewish law in order to belong to God's people. It is not, in that sense, the church is not ethnically exclusive or racially particular. You don't have to be of a particular ethnic group or to adopt somebody else's ethnic identity. Now, what was important and why this reading of Paul really took on and became very influential in the 1990s and since that time is that it gave careful attention to Paul's historical context. It grew out of very good historical work on what Judaism was like at the time of Paul, what we call Second Temple Judaism. It also gave the primary attention, and this went along with the ethos of the time, it gave primary attention not so much to the individual as to social relationships, as to the relationship between Jews and non-Jews, and the way that in which the early Christian church tried to cross that ethnic boundary. So the issue for Paul, so Dunn argues, is not about works righteousness. It's about whether there is an ethnic prejudice or privilege, whether Judaism is exclusive, whether it is confined to or limited or restricted to Jews alone, or whether now in Christ the people of God is redefined as crossing that ethnic boundary. Now, those issues of ethnic identity and of ethnic exclusion were very, very important at the time that Dunn was writing, and he related this directly to contemporary issues of his day, like apartheid in South Africa, just as he also related it to the ways in which Christian churches split and divide and exclude one another. He was a Methodist, but very involved in ecumenical relations between the churches here in Durham and throughout the UK. He was also carefully trying to avoid any kind of caricatures of Judaism or any hint of anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism in our reading of Paul. Now, what does all that mean for how he actually reads Paul in this commentary? Well, the first thing to say is he explores the historical background of this letter, and he argues that behind the letter are tensions in the community in Rome between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians to do with the history of the community in Rome, the Christian community in Rome, and that he sees evidence for those tensions between Jews and Gentiles in, for instance, Romans 14 and 15, material about food in those chapters. He also gives careful attention to those chapters in Romans 9 to 11, which are about Israel, which have often been interpreted in the Protestant tradition as merely an illustration of the doctrine of justification by faith, but which Dunn and others of his day insisted is not merely an illustration or peripheral to Romans, as if Paul had said everything important by the end of Romans 8, but Dunn insisted Romans 9 to 11 are integral to the whole concern of Paul's letter to the Romans, because they are about Israel and they're about how God's purposes for Israel relate to and are taken up by and changed in the context of the Gentile mission. Now, if the context, historical context, is about Jews and Gentiles, if Romans 9 to 11 is an important, even the climax of this letter, then what Paul says about justification by faith in Romans 1 to 4 in particular also looks different. And Dunn highlights how important in these chapters are what Paul says about Jews and Gentiles, not just about the individual sinner being justified by faith, but about the ethnic groups of Jew and Gentile. This is a gospel, Paul insists, that is for everyone. That is to say, for the Jew first and also the Greek. So when Paul critiques here justification by works of the law, Dunn argues, he's critiquing not justification by good works, by our own self-reliance. He's critiquing rather, Dunn argues, the ways in which Jewish boundary markers or identity badges have been made important by some people as the entry point for the Christian community. And he's attacking not Jewish self-righteousness, but Jewish national or ethnic privilege. So, for instance, when Dunn reads Romans 4 about Abraham, what he emphasizes there is how Paul portrays Abraham as the father of Gentile as well as Jew, the father of all, his faith and his experience of the grace of God extending across the ethnic boundary. Now, if Paul's critique in Romans is not against works in general or good works, then that means we can be more attentive perhaps to what Paul says about ethics in Romans. And Dunn puts a lot of emphasis on the fact that justification by faith does not exclude the performance of good works. In fact, it is the foundation for holiness in Romans 6 and for the ethical practices that Paul instructs on in Romans 12 to 15. Paul's letter to the Romans has been absolutely central to the understanding of Paul in general and Paul's theology in general, but also absolutely central to the whole Christian understanding of salvation, particularly in Western theology as influenced by Augustine and onwards. So how we read Romans is important for our whole understanding of the Bible. And Romans was particularly important in the Protestant tradition and is much cited and indeed central to the theology both of Luther and of Calvin. Dunn's commentary on Romans in some important respects breaks with the Protestant tradition of readings of Paul. It's not anti-Protestant, but it shifts the ways and the frameworks in which Protestants read Romans. I think the new perspective can indeed be taken up theologically within Protestant theology and within non-Protestant theology too. The new perspective has theological implications and is certainly open to theological interpretation. But it is a shift, an important shift from some of the ways in which Protestantism has handled this very important letter. Dunn's commentary is always clear, detailed, well argued, doesn't just deal with big generalizations, it focuses very specifically on the text. It, as it were, showed that the new perspective on Paul was a possible reading of the whole letter. Now, not everybody agrees with everything Dunn said in his interpretation of Romans, but this commentary and Dunn's other work laid the foundation, together with the work of Sanders and Tom Wright and others, it laid the foundation for a highly significant new direction in in the study of Paul, which continues to this day. So I'm delighted that this commentary has now been translated by the Editora Academia Christa, and I commend it to all readers because I know you will gain much from Dunn's work and his careful, close reading of Romans in this great commentary. Thank you.